Hi there, class. I hope you're doing well. In this video, we're going to be talking about Francis Bacon's experimental inductive method. All right, so in the video, we're going to start by talking about how Francis Bacon thought about the nature of knowledge and its relation to practical science. We'll also talk about the kinds of methods that he's trying to replace or give alternatives to, including the heavy reliance on deduction and syllogistic reasoning from the Aristotelian methods that he rejects, and how these also rely on various first principles as anticipations of nature. But then instead, we're going to look at his proposed method as an alternative that he calls true induction that relies on interpretations instead of anticipations of nature. And then at the end of the video, we'll give a brief summary of all these ideas and present a kind of outline of the method that Bacon is proposing. So it's good to start with the first aphorism from the reading here. So notice here, he's making a critical claim about the role of our observations for gaining understanding about the world, insofar as he says this is the source of our understanding, and we cannot know anything beyond what we are able to understand through our observation. And notice this is a claim about our knowledge of the natural world. So observation provides our human minds with the ability to gain knowledge about the natural world, and the extent of our observations sets the limits of that ability. We can't go beyond those observations. Now, all of this discussion fits pretty well into what's often thought of as a kind of canonical narrative about the history of modern philosophy that often frames it in terms of two competing views. On the one side, we have empiricist views, and on the other side, we have these rationalist views. The empiricist views are a family of philosophical views that emphasize the foundational and essential role of sensory experience in explaining our thought and knowledge about the natural world around us. But rationalism emphasizes the foundational essential role of a faculty of reason, or a faculty of rational intuition, in explaining our thought and knowledge about the world. The canonical narrative of early modern philosophy presents it as if we start out with rationalist views that are slowly replaced by empiricist views until we finally get to Kant as the culmination of this debate, where he tries to synthesize both of these two views into a kind of compromise or hybrid view. That canonical narrative is flawed in a number of ways, and we need to keep in mind here first, the previous is not intended as rigorous definitions of empiricism or rationalism. They're just meant to get us thinking about some of the themes that come up during this historical period. But that distinction itself is also problematic as is because there are more or less extreme versions of empiricism and rationalism. Moreover, empiricism isn't just one thesis. It's a whole host and set of different theses that are often associated with one another. And so philosophers might be empiricist in some ways, but rationalist in other kinds of ways. And so to try to view this as here are the rationalists on this side and here are the empiricists on the other side is just, it fails to appreciate the subtlety in all of these different authors' views. But moreover, that canonical narrative framing the history of modern philosophy as a debate between these two camps is also problematic because, one, these authors were often interested in much more than just this debate. They were talking about a whole bunch more. Moreover, it oftentimes doesn't fully capture what their concerns were. So, for instance, Francis Bacon is associated with the history of empiricist thought. And so you might think that Francis Bacon is criticizing rationalist methods, but that's not actually his focus. In context, he was criticizing Aristotle's earlier methods, which were themselves empiricist in nature. So he was criticizing a different version of empiricism and trying to replace it with his own better version of empiricism. And so, in one sense, he was trying to do the same thing that Descartes was doing, insofar as they were both critical of Aristotle's empirical methods. They just had different ideas about what to replace it with. But nonetheless, thinking of these families of views as rough and ready ideas can still help us try to gain an initial foothold for investigating the views of these modern philosophers. We just have to keep those caveats in mind so that we're willing to make exceptions and clarifications for each of the authors as we discover how their views are much more subtle than if you were to try to just fit them clearly in one camp or the other. But now notice when we go back to this aphorism from Francis Bacon, he's not just making a claim about our understanding, he's also making a claim about us as the minister of nature, the person who oversees nature and tries to bend it to our will. He's talking about our abilities to do things and the kinds of capabilities we have for engaging with the world. So when we put both those two ideas together, He's saying observation provides our human minds with the ability to gain knowledge about the natural world and with the power to manipulate nature for our own ends. And the extent of our observations is also what sets the limits to both of those kinds of abilities. Notice that there's a kind of progressivist account of history here where we can make progress in making human life better. All right, so in this regard, it's important to maybe look at two other aphorisms. Aphorism 3, he says, knowledge and human power are synonymous, since ignorance of the cause frustrates the effect, right, prevents us from being able to produce the effect. Right. For nature is only subdued by submission, and that which is in contemplative philosophy corresponds with the cause, in practical science becomes the rule. And then also aphorism 4, he goes on to say, man, while operating, can only apply or withdraw natural bodies. Nature internally performs the rest. One thing I want to emphasize about this is that it seems like he's not merely making the claim that knowledge gives us more power over the world. Bacon seems to also be making a claim about the nature or criteria for having knowledge in the first place. So contemplative philosophy, as he mentions, is seeking causes as explanations, to satisfy our curiosity, to try to give us certainty about the world and understand why things happened a certain way. In that way, it's sort of backward looking. A phenomena happens, and then we want to understand why it happened and how it happened. But his practical science is seeking causes, not in the sense of explaining the things that we have observed, but in giving us information that's going to allow us to manipulate the world for our ends. All right, so it's forward-looking in terms of the kinds of benefits we can get by understanding those causes. We can produce new effects instead of just understanding the things that already exist in the world. So while a theory might make nature intelligible to us by explaining it maybe in terms that we already accept, if it doesn't provide us with power over nature, then we don't truly know it, according to Bacon. Right. So this relates to a kind of utilitarian picture of science and a progressive picture of history where nature is out there for our own use, for us to manipulate to our own ends to benefit humanity. To illustrate Bacon's view about science here, think about the example of disease. All right, when someone has a disease or they have various symptoms that we notice, someone might come up with a theory. And that theory might be really helpful as we contemplate and try to understand it in the sense that it might help us make sense of why it happened and thereby satisfy our curiosity in our mind. But in order to truly understand that disease, we need to be able to identify the causes of that disease. If we understand the causes of that disease, we can thereby intervene and maybe take the cause away or add the cause so as to produce the disease or to cure the disease. The idea is our knowledge here ought to be productive. It ought to be practical. Knowledge is for the sake of application instead of just theoretical understanding. So consider aphorism 11 here. He says, as the present sciences are useless for the discovery of effects, so the present system of logic is useless for the discovery of the sciences. And so his criticism here is that the scientific principles, or the principles about the operation of nature, say in terms of matter and form, from Aristotle, can only explain the effects that have already occurred, that we've already observed. They cannot be used to produce new effects. They can't help us determine rules for manipulating nature and thereby have the power to produce the effects that might be beneficial to humanity in various ways. And similarly, he thinks the current methods of investigation, so the logical principles that are utilized, inspired by Aristotle, do not help us discover these new scientific principles about the operation of nature, about causes. They only reveal what was already known or believed. And so I'm just going to call this his unproductiveness worry about the Aristotelian method. It might be able to explain what has come before. It's backward looking in that way, but it doesn't produce new principles or rules or effects with us. And so it fails to be forward looking and practical in the way that Bacon thinks science ought to be. And similarly, now focusing on logic, he says the syllogism consists of propositions of words. Words are the signs of notions or ideas. If, therefore, the notions, which form the basis of the whole, be confused and carelessly abstracted from things, if we have certain scientific principles, and then we use syllogisms in order to try to arrive at new conclusions or about other kinds of principles, well, then the conclusions we derive from those initial principles are only going to be as strong as the premises. And so if those premises are built on confused and careless ideas or notions, then every conclusion we came from those confused ideas is also going to be questionable. So let's call that the weak foundation worry. Bacon's reference to a syllogism in that aphorism is referring to a two-premise deductive argument in Aristotelian categorical logic. So this is a kind of logic that deals with the categories of things. So an example of this would be all rational animals are things with the capacity for language, and all humans belong to the category of rational animals. Given those two scientific principles, by logic, we can conclude that all humans are things with the capacity for language. We now have this new principle about the nature of human beings. Now, Bacon is arguing that this kind of syllogism that engages in this kind of deductive form where the premises must guarantee the conclusion, he says there's two limitations of this. First, because of this deductive form, their conclusions never contain any new information beyond the information already contained in their premises. The idea here is that this argument might give us an explanation of why humans have the capacity for language, but that is only an explanation of some knowledge or some principle that was already implicit in the information in the premises themselves. So we don't explain some new principle that we were unaware of already. We just explain the information that was already present in the premises themselves. But moreover, he says, this kind of argument can only provide knowledge of the conclusion when we have knowledge of its premises. It doesn't tell us how to discover the initial foundational premises, and so the syllogism cannot get us started in the sciences. And he says there are and can exist but two ways of investigating and discovering truth. He says the one hurries on rapidly from the senses and particulars to the most general axioms, and from them as principles and their supposed indisputable truth, derives and discovers the intermediate axioms. He says this is the way now in use, the way inspired by Aristotle. At least Aristotle was a kind of empiricist in natural philosophy. He believed experience is what provided the foundations for natural philosophy. It's what helped us identify and come to know the first scientific principles that could then be used as the basis of syllogism that would allow us to discover other principles of nature. So experience for Aristotle is more robust than just a flash of raw sensations. Experience for Aristotle came from our sensations plus memories we had of the same thing previously. So an infant might see you, who happen to be human, but when I see you, I have various memories simultaneous with these sensations that thereby produce in me an experience of you as a human. So I don't just see a shape and colors, I experience you as a human. I categorize you as a human in my experience itself. And so experience is thereby more than just a sensation of a particular thing. In normal conditions, on Aristotle's view, experience involves me becoming aware of a thing's form or its like general nature or essence. And it's due to this grasp of that form or general nature that experience then provides us with knowledge of first principles. We see the general nature and thereby come to know the general truth from that experience directly. But what are the mechanisms by which our mind, using memory and sensation, creates this experience, whereby our mind automatically categorizes you as a human being? Bacon describes it as a common induction. Nowadays, we would call this enumerative induction, where we enumerate or number various examples of things and then come to a general conclusion about that category or class of things. So the idea here is, here's one example of something being F, here's a second thing that is F, here's a third A that is F, and as I get more and more of these examples in my memories, now eventually when I see something, I then experience it as having the general nature of A's having F, all right? And so I come to know this general principle. So here's an example of this. Previously, maybe I see Sam, and Sam's a human. I discover that Sam is a rational animal. And then I see Hannah, she's a human, and I discover she's a rational animal. And then I see Nora, see that she's a human, see that she's a rational animal. And now I see all these examples, and I have these gathered up in my memory. And now, next time I encounter a human being, the idea here is I don't go through any kind of argument in my mind, but just from these memories, my mind then automatically gets in touch with, when I see the next human, this form of the human as a rational animal. I see the humanness, the rationality in their humanity, so to speak. And so because I can see the rationality in their humanity, I thereby know this general principle. So Bacon describes this method as we start at the bottom with sensations in particular instances. All right. And we gather these in our memory. And then that memory creates this experience, which then delivers this knowledge of these first scientific principles, the most general principles. Say that all rational animals have the capacity for language, and the principle that all human beings are rational animals. And then from those most general scientific principles that are delivered to us by having an experience where we are in contact with the essence or nature of that thing, we then move downwards to more specific, intermediate, general scientific principles. So notice that argument before. Notice the first two premises are more general than the conclusion that says all humans are things with the capacity for language. The first principle is about all rational animals. The second one is about humans as rational animals. And from that, I come to say all humans are things that have this particular capacity. So I want to go back to this picture real quick, because during Bacon's time, it was common to distinguish between deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning in terms of where in the reasoning general propositions or particular propositions occurred. Bacon was thinking of induction as reasoning that moves from the particular examples to general principles or rules, and he was thinking as deductive reasoning as reasoning that starts with general principles and moves to more specific or more particular things. So on this kind of method that Bacon is attributing to Aristotle, the kinds of processes that lead to the first scientific general principles are inductive processes. The experience in our mind is created by a kind of inductive process by which our mind gets in contact with the form. From those general principles, the orange here, we then use deductive reasoning to go from the more general to the more particular. Bacon refers to this method as the anticipation of nature. From your memories of the particulars, your mind thereby anticipates how nature behaves, but he thinks this kind of method is problematic. That's led to a whole bunch of principles that are not very helpful, that are insecure, that give us a weak foundation. The results of this kind of method, he says, we have no sound notions either in logic or physics. Substance, quality, action, passion, and existence are not clear notions, much less weight, levity, density, tenuity, moisture, dryness, generation, corruption, attraction, repulsion, element, matter, form, and the like. All are fantastic and ill-defined. So these are the kinds of terms you might see in the most general principles, scientific principles in this kind of Aristotelian science. But he thinks none of these are clear. They're really the result of our mind jumping to conclusions. But notice in that previous passage, he said there can exist two ways. And so that first way, he says, is problematic. That's the way people have been currently trying to reason and discover and think about the natural world. He says the other kind of reasoning constructs its axioms from the senses and particulars by ascending continually and gradually till it finally arrives at the most general axioms, which is the true but unattempted way. So he calls this true induction because it's induction all the way up. All right, you don't go up like to the top and then try to deductively reason to the middle. So he pictures it as starting at the sensations and particular instances, reasoning up to intermediate general scientific principles, and then using those to reason to more general scientific principles. Right? So you're always reasoning from the more particular or specific to the more general. Bacon refers to this method as the interpretation of nature. You are constantly just gathering more data and then interpreting the data that you have. And then you use that interpretation to then devise new methods for discovering more data, which you can then use to construct even more general principles, until we arrive at the most fundamental causes in the universe. Bacon says that when we form these anticipations of nature, we are essentially arriving at generalities through the laziness of our mind. Right? We only want to gather a few instances. We don't want to do the hard, honest toil of collecting all of the various instances. We want to see a few common easy to find instances that we can discover in our ordinary, normal interaction with the world, and then use that as a basis to project it to all other instances. Once we've done that, he says we then use logic or the syllogism to basically like hide our mistakes, or maybe even hide those mistakes even to ourselves for the sake of ostentation of dispute. So the syllogism is just a way to help us like fancy up the way we argue with others, to make ourselves seem smart, to kind of hide the laziness we had when we came to those general principles in the first place. And he says anticipations are also easier for people to believe since they generalize the familiar and common examples that we thereby easily discover and remember. And anticipations and logic or deductions are helpful thereby for forcing assent rather than things. So they're helpful for convincing others as a matter of rhetoric because they're going to appeal to examples that are going to be familiar to everyone and come easily to mind because they're the ones that happen most often. The examples that are rare and out of the ordinary course of nature, those examples, since they're not as familiar, they're harder to remember. And so since the anticipations match all like the paradigmatic examples we'd run into in the normal course of our lives, it's very easy for people to assent to those kinds of principles because it matches their experiences and memories. But he says those general appearances in the form of anticipations, they don't actually reveal reality. It's not getting in contact with the nature or form of the object, but rather they are informed by the nature or operation of our own mind. Our mind is not a blank slate that just receives the impression of these objects. He says all the perceptions of both of the senses and the mind bear reference to man and not to the universe. And the human mind resembles those uneven mirrors, which impart their own properties to different objects, from which rays are emitted and distort and disfigure them. As one maybe primary example of this, just think of a person who has jaundice and thereby experiences various objects as having a more yellow color. The idea there is their senses are thereby actually reflecting their own constitution, the yellowness in their eyes, as opposed to any yellowness in the object itself. Because our senses are both a product not just of the object we are sensing, but also by the nature of our own mind, that makes those general appearances or anticipations prone to bias and illusion. But now, when we go to interpretations, he says there's a difficulty as well, because the understanding, when left to itself in a man of steady, patient, and reflecting disposition, so someone who doesn't jump to these conclusions, only goes as far in their beliefs as their observations allow them to. So that kind of person can make some attempt in the right way for discovering principles, but with very little effect. They're not going to achieve very much, since the understanding, undirected and unassisted, is unequal and unfit for the task of vanquishing the obscurity of things. The idea is the nature of objects is hidden from us. And so if we just try to use our mind, even if we do it slowly and steadily and very systematically, we're not going to be able to discover very much. And this is why he says, just like the hand needs assistance because it doesn't have very much power, effects are produced by means of instruments and helps, which the understanding requires no less than the hand. This is the point of experiments. We can use experiments to create new observations that we wouldn't have encountered in the normal course of our everyday lives. And then we can use those principles to create new kinds of instruments, like microscopes and telescopes, that will then allow us to make even more observations, which can then help our mind try to discover the correct principles and causes of nature. Putting all this together, here's a kind of outline of Bacon's method. First, we make systematic and unbiased observations of particular instances of phenomena or properties, such as heat. Now, what's really critical to Bacon's method is that we need to make observations where we say where heat is present, and then we need to say where heat is absent, both in normal conditions and abnormal conditions. And we need to make observations about the relation between this phenomena and other ones. Don't just say that there is heat when there is fire, that'd be presence, but also say there is not heat when there is ice and snow. Say where it's absent. And don't just say where there is heat in normal conditions, also say where it is in abnormal conditions. But also the relations here is, well, notice as heat goes up, water boils more vigorously. As heat goes down, water boils less vigorously. All of those observations about particular instances need to be gathered, and he's recommended actually gathering them and creating these tables where we have instances of presence, instances of absences, instances of variation. Right. And from that data, we can then formulate immediate generalizations, but those generalizations should not go beyond the observations that we have actually made. So if I've only observed how fish behave in Alabama lakes, I should only make a claim, a generalization, about fish in Alabama. I shouldn't make a claim about all fish in the United States, for instance. But once I have those immediate generalizations, I can then use them to create new instruments, new experiments, and thereby discover new particulars. So once I discover general principles about how light interacts with lenses, for instance, specifically, then I can build a telescope, which will then allow me to observe new things further away and get new data to come to even more general positions about how light behaves not just with lenses, not just on Earth, but also in the night sky. And so the ability to produce new effects and make new discoveries verifies those original immediate hypotheses, that productiveness is a sign that we have the right generalizations, and the observations of those new particulars then provides us that additional data from which we can formulate even more encompassing generalizations. So we are slowly going from more specific to more and more general as we gather more data. We rinse and repeat until we eventually ascend to the most general principle or causes within nature. All right, so that's all for this video. I'll see you all in the next one. Bye-bye.